Which one of these gets a little more volume? One? Good. Thanks. I know last week some people at the back weren't hearing me. I didn't. While Pete isn't strong enough voice that he can do it well without the mic.
Loud. Loud.
Strong enough voice. I tend to be a little quiet. I found out that the big guy is quiet most of the time. Then when he does need the thunder for some reason, it gets a whole lot of attention. My dad used to tell me if the big guys in life were as mean and nasty as the little guys, there wouldn't be any little guys. I want to share a story that I know it was told just a matter of a few years ago, but some of you may or may not have heard it. But it relates to the theme this morning. Probably a decade ago, maybe more than that now, the missions ministry here at the Hills sent John and Linda Glover to Uganda for a period of time, a short-term mission. And John specifically was there to help do leadership training at some of the churches, the rural churches they call them. And they would go and conduct a class or some teaching for the church. Of course, in an environment like that, anybody comes. You're in a village and maybe there's some sort of covered spot or it's under a tree and they set up chairs and everybody comes. And he was teaching in this one village. And two women came up sort of late, sat down, and he noticed sort of an unusual stir in the crowd, in the church there, but didn't put much stock on it. But then at the end, he was doing a question and answer period, and one of the women stuck her hand up and said, I have a question. I'm a believer, I'm a Christian, but I still have this idol at home. And sometimes when things are really hard, I go and pray to the idol. Make a little sacrifice and pray to my idol. What should I do? And John said, burn it. And there was some discussion back and forth, and soon it was decided that the next week she was going to bring her idol to the church. The church was going to burn it. Be done with that. Try to get her away from that wrong dependency. Well, the other woman was with her, said, well, what's involved in becoming a Christian? There was a big murmur in the crowd there, and John taught, preached gospel to her, and at the end, she decided it was time to be baptized now. They all got up and went down to the river. Church was shocked, but prayed and singing and giving glory to God. And after she came out of the water, the woman said, I don't know, wait till next week to get rid of my idols, I'm going to do it now. And the whole church was big stirred, and John still didn't know what this was about. They went to her house, her hut, and she and some other people began to bring out box after box after box of idols and trinkets and things of spiritual force and so forth. She was one of the village shaman. She was bringing out her livelihood to be burned. Because these were things she sold to people to make money for herself, to give them power over the demon. And then she said, here out back, they went out back to the house where there was a grove of trees, and in this grove of trees there were several small, brightly colored houses built. She said, this is where I come to meet with the demons. The demons stay in these houses. That tore down those houses and cut down an entire grove of trees. And the whole church was amazed and sang and praised and danced and gave glory to God for all this was happening. And it was an Ephesus type moment where the people brought all their books of magic and so forth to be burned. She said, here, this, if I'm going to do that, this has to go. And it has to go now. And so, how she ended up making a living, I don't know. but she trusted that she would be able to without that, and gave that to God. Because she realized that not only do I have one God now, one Lord now, but all these representations of other gods need to go. John Calvin, one of the Reformation leaders, once said that human understanding, or the human mind, is a perpetual idol-making factory. Do you think that's true? Yes. We constantly have to battle the tendency to try to shape God into our own understanding. We visualize a God who approves us as we live our lives, even if we know we're falling short. Not just because of His grace, but because we're trying to make Him be what we want Him to be. But only God can reveal what He is like. In one sense, the second commandment, I believe, tells mankind, don't try to tell me what I'm like. I will tell you what I'm like. And it's important that you correctly understand that I'll accept no representations of me. And the command talks about making graven images, things that look like things from the heavens, or things from the sea, or the animals, or the trees. This is one of the ongoing problems that Israel faced as they dealt with the pervasive idolatry around them, whether they could let go of those things and focus on God only. So it disavows any idols, any images, any likenesses. So you shall not worship them or serve them. In some instances, they wanted images of the false gods. In some instances, Scripture says they actually wanted images that they thought represented God, Yahweh. But all were disallowed. But do we have to have wood or metal or stone to have an idol? No? So what would be one of these idols?
An idol can be anything that takes your attention off God.
Okay, an idol can be anything that substitutes or takes your attention off God. Anything can yes. No.
In today's society, in this country, many good, smart, intelligent people in business have made their business and growing their business their new idol that really replaced God. They've neglected their families and neglected other parts of their lives, especially the spiritual part. And some of these people started out as Christians, but by the time they got toward the end of their lives, they were not at all, because they had left God for their new God, which was building their business.
Okay. Yeah, it's coming.
Maybe I look at idols different than most people, but isn't an idol something that you think is going to do something for you? You could pray to that idol and it will grant your desires, or it's something that's that you worship, that is going to do something for you. And when we talk about other things like jobs or hobbies or whatever as being an idol, I just don't think of them that way. I don't pray to that. I don't think it's going to do anything for me long term and save me and all of that. So I guess I look at it differently.
No, that's an appropriate way to look at it. I think, though, some of these situations for us, I know people like the ones that Bill was referring to. And over time, their job became their object of worship. It's not that they would invest everything in that job. Every everything in that direction of their lives. All their power and all their money was given to that because they derived more power and more money from that. And ultimately, for many people, the thing that becomes the idol is anything that they believe gives them power. Anything they believe, can give them more esteem. And whether and so are they praying to it, saying, "Oh, do this for me"? No, not necessarily. But they've invested themselves in a way that becomes the object of their affection, the object of their devotion.
The way that's loud. The way I've always thought about it is having an idol in your heart is whenever anything comes before your willingness to submit to God. And in my own life, the way that I've observed that is in the past year, in 2018, oh gosh, it's 2019 now, isn't it? In 2018, at the very beginning of the year, I was going through a really low time. I was very lonely. I was tired of being single, and I felt God ask me, tell me, you've held marriage as an idol in your heart above me for a long time. Would you be willing to not be married for me? And I never prayed to an idea of marriage. I never held it as an idol in that sense in my heart, but I definitely held it in such a high esteem that I genuinely had to wonder, like, if God wanted me to be celibate, if I never got married, if I never had kids, if I never followed that life and I was doing it because I was being faithful to God's plan for me, would I be okay with that? And I think the moment that I realized I was having a hard time answering that is the moment I realized it was an idol and it became easy to let it go.
Okay, very good. Okay, Pete?
I think the essence of it is seen much in what Paul has to say in Romans 1 about idolatry, when he says of some, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. But then he goes on to say, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. And I think that's the essence of it. Idolatry is when you worship creation rather than the Creator. And sometimes it is a man-made icon, totem, fetish thing. Sometimes it's a tangible thing, and sometimes it's a girl or a sport or a job. Like, it can be anything that is created that becomes the object of our affection rather than the one who created.
Very good. Yeah, in terms of marriage, I know some people who their marriage is their object of devotion. That's where they invest. And a marriage should be invested in. But they invest more time and more energy in trying to sustain the marriage than do in giving attention to God. Or they invest more time and more energy in their job, more time and more energy into a hobby, into something that they hold importance in their lives, but it kind of takes a new place, takes a new position. And so we assign, anything becomes idolatrous, I believe, when we assign a dignity and value to it that it doesn't deserve. More dignity and value than, marriage does require dignity and value, but if you begin to assign more to it, okay?
I think I understand exactly what you're saying. And that's why this verse, to me, speaks differently, a different flavor, because it's not an object, in a sense. Colossians 3. Therefore, put to death what belongs to your worldly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. So now you've got to place, apparently those are those things, and then idols.
Yes.
And I don't know that he's, well, for me, because of these, God's wrath comes on the disobedient. And you once walked in these things when you were living in them, but now you must also put away all of our anger, wrath, malice, slander, and filthy language from your mouth. And I wonder sometimes how that fits into idolatry too. that we like to argue, be angry, etc.
With everything, many people know I can argue and I can be angry, and I try to remind myself, try to remind others what Paul had to say about that. Which is, my paraphrase is, be angry and get over it. Be angry and don't hurt anybody in your anger. Don't sin in your anger. And then the second part of that verse in the Greek is best translated, don't let the day end on your festering anger or your lingering resentment. So sure, you're going to have that burst and let it go. And if you cling to it, not only does it become acid to you and acid to the relationship with another person, then eventually it can become your idol too. Because it's this thing you're giving so much time and so much devotion to. My grudge becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. It's the basis of feuds or any number of things. Yes.
That what we spend the most time on, and I'm as guilty as the next person, is the cell phone. Either playing games or Facebook or the internet or whatever. But it seems like the world has made that an idol.
Yep.
And it takes all of your time. It takes all of your, quote, devotion, because you're devoted to back on finding out whatever. And I think that's part of Satan's ploy.
It is. There was a great little, what do you call it, an article. This is a brief note. This is, what if we all treated our Bible like we treat our cell phone? Checking it constantly throughout the day. Looking for the latest news and encouragement. What if we were upgrading it frequently? Getting a new and better version, something that's more easy to read, more easy to understand. And it was one of those, because we got this in my pocket. Main reason I'm like my wife, main reason I got a smartphone is because she was feeling that she had to buy get one for school when she was teaching. And I was not going to pay for 2 separate plans. So I got one too. And now, of course, I'm just like anybody else is here. And, I'll be glad to show you pictures of my grandchildren or messages for our daughter, and or let you listen to a sound clip or singing. But there it is. So yes, it becomes a matter too.
This discussion reminds me of, I think, of what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. Adultery starts with lust, and murder starts with hate. And an idol, a named God with an image, is obviously an idol. But when greed and the other things that are mentioned as idolatry, those are more the things that start in the heart. And I think that's the connection there.
Some things start in the heart and some things start in the mind. And we'll separate those for now. Actually, the Greek view of the world, this was mine. This was emotion. When it speaks of having a heart of compassion, the literal translation would be bowels of compassion. And you think about it, when you're really, really worked up, you're really a lot of emotion, maybe anger or excitement, where do you feel it? You don't, maybe your heart's racing, but you really feel it down here. And certainly don't feel it up here. This may be what's leading part of the reaction. But what about the things you wouldn't expect? And I'm doing this because of a specific thing I'm aware of. And it's maybe a little less so, or certainly less here at the Hills. It may still be a problem in some, let's say, more conservative churches. I have known people, and I think it's an unintentional thing, but who followed a form of bibliolatry.
Repeat that, please.
They followed a form of bibliolatry, whereas this became one of their idols. That the Bible was so sacred to them that they almost worshipped it. Dr. Tom Albright, who was one of our professors at school, talked about in the Bible saying there's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. He said, but many people practice God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Scriptures. Because that became more important to them than the Spirit. They were afraid of what the Spirit knew. And so not only denied the power of the Spirit, which I believe is very, very wrong, as you know, the possible getting to the point of blasphemy, but it put the Bible in a place of reverence it did not deserve. Way remember the time of the 8-track tape player? So about 1970, so I was all of 19 years old, I think. Well, I would have been 19 years and 70, but I had my tape player in the car, and there was it stopped someplace with my Bible in the seat, and some rock and roll tapes there. One of them may have been the soundtrack from Woodstock. There, and the sister in the church saw that and almost fainted. I mean, she got so worked up and so irritated that she just I received a stern lecture, you know, not necessarily about my choice of music, but that I would desecrate the Bible by having to sit there on the seat with those tapes. She was more concerned about that book than she was about me or what I was listening to. That's a new Bible. That had become so important to her life that the person didn't matter. And I was abused by it. It was a time when I wasn't sure where I stood in terms of faith. And I had, it was like one foot at church and 1 foot in the drug world. And where am I going to be? And here's this woman saying, oh, you know, this is terrible, terrible. I went, what? What's that about? You know, that this would be the attitude. And then there's this part of the commandment that may seem unusual to some of us, and when God said, I'm a jealous God. He says, don't have idols, I am a jealous God. In fact, there's a later, after the people had sinned with the golden calf and things were beginning to be rebuilt, God said, my name is jealous. What do we make of that? When we think of jealousy as being something that's a negative thing, but we think of God saying, I'm a jealous God. Thoughts? He wants all of you.
And he has the right to expect it, like a spouse has the right to expect it from spouse.
Good. Very good. I make a distinction in terms of a single word. And first, I will tell a story. We were living in Massachusetts, and so when our son was about 5 years old, so it was 35 years ago, and one of the sisters in the church had bought a house, and it needed a bunch of work. And so we all descended there around her house. We didn't need paint. This was nuclear chartreuse paint on this house. It was just, glow-in-the-dark house. And so it needed to be painted, and it was scrubbed and stuff that she hadn't been cared for, which is one reason she was able to afford it. And so we were all there cleaning. And I had been counseling with her son, and we were talking about some things. We happened to be sitting on the stone fence behind her house, next to each other. And put my arm around her as we were talking. And she leaned her head over. It was just nothing there. Our son, Colin, came up, looked at that, dived in with his hands like this to push us apart, saying, you already have a lady. He was jealous. Not jealous of the sister. He was jealous for my relationship with his mother. And I see this jealousy of God not as being, what does God have to be jealous of? He's not threatened by anything, but he was jealous for his relationship with his people. Bill?
You hit the nail on the head there, because God doesn't need us, but he wants us. And being the master psychologist since he created us, he knows how our mind works. So when he says, have nothing before me, nothing before you except me, he is understanding the way our mind gets distracted by other things. And anything that we put out there that gets our attention a little bit more than him, and that includes words and phrases and all of that, that demean him as to who he is, then that demeans him in my mind. And he knows that. So when he says he's jealous, he's talking at how he wants me to look at him, because he doesn't want me to in any way see, accept, or work with anything that reduces his magnitude in my mind.
One of the authors I read viewed the required attitude toward the Second Amendment. The second. Boy, I've been hearing too much politics lately. The Second Commandment. God didn't amend His law. God, here it is. Let's say it is. The Second Commandment, also the first, as requiring a necessary intolerance. Which I found very interesting, because sometimes I feel that in our culture, tolerance has become one of the idols. It's not that being tolerant of people and ideas is wrong. We should be tolerant of people and ideas. But the tolerance and the importance of it has become revered and almost worshipped. So that we are, if you appear intolerant, then suddenly you're this. One of the ones that I'm always baffled by, because I say I believe that marriage is for man and woman only, I'm homophobic. I don't fear people who have same-sex attractions. But society wants to label me that because I'm not tolerant. I'm intolerant of that. And all I'm saying is this is what I believe is the right relationship. And so that has become one of the new gods for our culture. Yet the prophets of Israel continued to confront the people over their continued intolerance of and eventually worship of the gods of the nations around them. They weren't supposed to be there, and they certainly were supposed to worship them. If they did, and they became one of the many reasons that Israel ultimately met its punishment. Similarly, I think in our culture, freedom of religion is not just a matter of viewing that that's a good thing, but rather it's viewed as I'll call it glorified indifference. Whereas well, we've got freedom of religion, that's why I don't have to believe anything. And certainly not what you believe. And yet, that, as we discussed last week, that this is the point of what, first of all, what that in our law even meant, or the discussion meant, but certainly, certainly it goes to a position in terms of how we feel about people and ideas that becomes idolatrous in my mind. And we have those temptations too. Tolerating differences is tolerating differences must never lead to the adoption of the practices those differences may allow. Makes sense? Whereas I can tolerate differences, I can allow differences and tolerate differences and recognize differences. But that tolerance should not lead me there. It must not lead me to adopt that.
Glenn,
Yes.
you said that tolerance should not what?
Lead me to the point of adopting those things. In other words, I would be tolerant of people, you know, when my children accused me of being homophobic the first time, I was working, or had been working in a company where at least 60% of the people on the staff were homosexual men. Because they kept hiring their friends. And if I were homophobic, I couldn't work here. You know, I mean, if that were generally my mindset, I couldn't be there. Now, these people, these men, all knew my conviction. They all knew what I believed about marriage. They all knew what I believed about homosexuality. They also knew that I treated them with integrity and respect. To work with them because what they did outside of work and sometimes at work had nothing to do with what we're trying to do in terms of our business. And so we need to be sure we distinguish between tolerance and participation, tolerance and approval. To me, the bottom line of the second commandment is that it should be a constant reminder that what was one of the questions I asked you at the end of class, you know, whether there was something for the image of God around. And we, of all created things, were made in the image of God. Only we can be transformed in the spiritual image of Christ, who became flesh as the perfect image, perfect spiritual image of his Heavenly Father. So this commandment is about our special relationship with the Creator, who made us in his likeness and is still molding us into his spiritual image. It reminds us that God is greater than anything we can see or imagine. The reason that trying to make an image of God fails miserably, because there's nothing like him. There's not like him at all. And we should never let that knowledge be pushed aside, knowing that God views us this way and wants us to view him that way. And one time we didn't see how far we got with the third commandment. What is taking the Lord's name in vain? What does that mean? As he smiles? Are there answers behind smiles? What does it mean? To you or to our culture? What does it mean? Use it inappropriately, okay. That's sort of general, but we'll start with Eric. Yes?
Someone said to me once that we are God's ambassador, and when we're not, and we're God's
Okay, that's pretty good too. She said, someone told her that we are God's ambassadors, and we are not being good ambassadors. We're taking his name in vain. Yes? Treating is, that's very good, because the language there sort of says, don't treat my name as it's empty. You know, if it has no value or no no substance. The common assumption in most of our culture is that this relates to using God's name in some form of swearing. And certainly the Old Testament talked about don't use my name to swear at all. No. Don't use my name to make an oath or to swear unless you intend to keep it. Because if you don't intend to keep it, that's taking my name in vain. So it's not that that's not one of the forms, like parts of it, but it's something that does take us to another place. The Old Testament actually identifies several places, several different ways that God's name might be taken in vain. The most obvious would be the blasphemer curse, which happened as recorded in Leviticus 24, where a young man, we'll get right there, a young man whose father was an Egyptian, his mother was a Jewish, or Israel woman, got in a fight with someone, and in the fight he cursed God, because he used God's name in vain. As a curse, used God to curse this individual in the middle of the fight, and when it was learned, the recommended action was everyone put hands on him to demonstrate the judgment, and then stone him, kill him, because you don't do that.
I want to ask about the slang words that we use. Sometimes I'm really bad about saying gosh, and Randy always gets on me. Or,
Thanks a lot from me.
well, you don't say it, geez, or, things like that. When I say that, I don't think about blaspheming or God's name, but how does he feel about that?
Yeah. And I don't know that there's a single answer for that. There's no question in my mind that things like gosh or geez, or now the popular thing is OMG, that there's no question where they came from. That people were trying to work around taking the name directly, trying to express their strength of view on something without invoking God's name, specifically. And so based on that, I would say, don't use it. Just avoid it. On the other hand, I would say to you, if that's not even in your mind, it's not even something that ever entered your consideration, then it's carelessness rather than intent. Still encourage you not to do it. Stop being careless. But you would never intentionally have a way of trying to invoke God's name in that situation. There are all sorts of things like that, that get me, I'll find irritating, and different people have a different view of it. In terms of swearing, if anyone goes to testify, testify in court in our state, and I assume it's in most states, what do they ask?
Do you solemnly swear
Or
confirm?
Affirm. Because they knew that some of these religious kooks, objected to be asked to put their hand on a Bible and swear. So will you affirm that you're going to tell the truth? And there's a difference, a minor difference, but it's saying, is my word good? Can my word be believed? And so that objection to the use of swearing or somehow invoking God's name made it into our courts. Because then people realize, some people can say, will you swear? They no. I'll tell you the truth, though. And so it became a different sort of an invocation.
And
Yes.
in light of what I said earlier about denigrating God's name and the vision of Him in our mind, OMG, that is on billions of messages and texts and all of that in our culture today, every day. Everybody knows what that means. Okay. In light of what God said in Deuteronomy, why do I have the right to take the ultimate being in the universe's name and incorporate it into a meaningless expletive?
Because where we are, I'm going to run quickly through some things here. He said you should not swear about my name falsely. That's in Leviticus 19. There's a prohibition of false visions and false claims by prophets. That was blaspheming God's name, saying, well, I have this vision. No, you don't. Sacrificing children to Molech. You know, because that was something that one of the nations did. This god Molech was wanted human flesh, specifically wanted children burned in the altar. And God's view of that is a violation of the commandment because it profaned the name of God. That's in Leviticus 18. But similarly, unlawfully touching holy things. If Aaron and his kin touched some of the holy elements of the sacrifice without proper reverence, that was considered profaning God's name. And if the priests cut corners, as they did in Malachi's day, that was considered profaning the name. You know, and most of those passages don't apply directly to us, but our words reveal our substance. Our words reveal the truth about who we are. We had a message for our daughter this morning, and she had prepared a big batch of lentils, and she's having more lentils, and I was going to respond with, you know, a humorous remark about what that does to your gastrointestinal system. And Allison was discouraging me. Why? Just don't go there. You know, because that reveals something about humor or you know, guys especially get on the bathroom humor too often. But our words should show our devotion. Let's skip over that. What is it about God's name that's so important? Holy? Okay, you want to back up?
There's one there. Is God His name?
Well, that's the name we have. And that's something I'm going to get, because actually you're leading into where I'm going here. Is that His name? You know, what we know of His name is from Hebrew is an abbreviation. You know, they left out the vowels and we make an assumption as Yahweh. When Moses was being given his commission by God, he said, all right, if I go there and they say, who is this God that sent you? What is your name? What do you say? Yeah. I come to be, what shall I say to them? Is replied, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And it could be in the Hebrew is to be. So, but it's God is that He is. Yeah, his identity is His name. And so we use God because that's something we've learned to represent us. But his identity is his name. Similarly, get to you in a second. In Exodus 33, boy, I'm losing my voice. Exodus 33, God was affirming Moses, excuse me. God was affirming Moses, and then Moses said, I want to see your glory. And we remember the part where God said, well, you can't do that and live, but here, hide over there, and I'll put my hand in front of your face, in front of you while I walk by, and you can see my back. But what we generally don't catch is something was said just before that. He said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim my name. A way to see or experience or know God's glory is to hear his name. Because his name is who he is. His name is tied up in his identity. His name is tied up in who he is. His name is tied up in his glory. That's one of the first things we know that Jesus said about God's name. Our Father who is in heaven, your name is holy. And so what is his name? All I can say is he said, I am. And in his existence, that shows him to be merciful and gracious. God revealed himself by speaking his name. And that's one reason it was so important that he kept reverence. I'm not out of time here. When I grew up, as I was growing up in the churches of Christ, something the church preserved and strengthened and wanted people to know as they wanted to be known, people with the book. And that was a good goal. You know, if you had a Bible question, you could go to the Church of Christ and get the answer. And then you get told about, why you're so lost and what you can do to make it happen. But what I really want for all of us to be known as people of his name. Supposed to be 35 years ago. And one of the sisters in the church had bought a house and it needed a bunch of work. And so we all descended there around her house. We didn't need paint. This was nuclear chartreuse paint on this house. It was just glow-in-the-dark house. And so it needed to be painted, and it was scrubbed and stuff that hadn't been cared for, which was one reason she was able to afford it. And so we were all there cleaning. And I had been counseling with her son, and we were talking about some things. We happened to be sitting on the stone fence behind her house, next to each other. And I put my arm around her as we were talking, and she leaned her head over. It was just nothing there. Our son, Colin, came up, looked at that, dived in with his hands like this to push us apart, saying, "You already have a lady." He was jealous. Not jealous of the sister, he was jealous for my relationship with his mother. And I see this jealousy of God not as being, what does God have to be jealous of? He's not threatened by anything, but he was jealous for his relationship with his people. Bill?
You hit the nail on the head there, because God doesn't need us, but he wants us. And being the master psychologist since he created us, he knows how our mind works. So when he says, have nothing before me, nothing before you except me, he is understanding the way our mind gets distracted by other things. And anything that we put out there that gets our attention a little bit more than him, and that includes words and phrases and all of that, that demean him as to who he is, then that demeans him in my mind. And he knows that. So when he says he's jealous, he's talking at how he wants me to look at him, because he doesn't want me to in any way see, accept, or work with anything that reduces his magnitude in my mind.
One of the authors I read viewed the required attitude toward the Second Amendment. Boy, I've been hearing too much politics lately. The Second Commandment, God didn't amend his law. God, here it is, that's the way it is. The Second Commandment also the first, as requiring a necessary intolerance. Which I found very interesting, because sometimes I feel that in our culture, tolerance has become one of the idols. It's not that being tolerant of people and ideas is wrong. We should be tolerant of people and ideas. But the tolerance and the importance of it has become revered and almost worshipped. So that we are, if you appear intolerant, then suddenly you're this. One of the ones that I'm always baffled by, because I say I believe that marriage is for man and woman only, I'm homophobic. I don't fear people who have same-sex attractions. But society wants to label me that because I'm not tolerant. You know, I'm intolerant of that. And all I'm saying is this is what I believe is the right relationship. And so that has become one of the new gods for our culture. Yet the prophets of Israel continued to confront the people over their continuing tolerance of and eventually worship of the gods of the nations around them. They weren't supposed to be there, and they certainly were supposed to worship them. If they did, and they became one of the many reasons that Israel ultimately met its punishment. Similarly, I think in our culture, freedom of religion is not just a matter of viewing that that's a good thing, but rather it's viewed as I'll call it glorified indifference. Whereas well, we've got freedom of religion, that's so I don't have to believe anything. And certainly not what you believe. And yet, that, as we discussed last week, that this is the point of what, first of all, what that in our law even meant, or the discussion meant, but certainly it goes to a position in terms of how we feel about people and ideas that becomes idolatrous in my mind. And we have those temptations too. Tolerating differences must never lead to the adoption of the practices those differences may allow. Make sense? Whereas I can tolerate differences, I can allow differences and tolerate differences and recognize differences. But That tolerance should not lead me there. It must not lead me to adopt that.
Glenn,
Yes,
you said that tolerance should not what?
lead me to the point of adopting those things. In other words, I would be tolerant of people, you know, when my children accused me of being homophobic the first time, I was working, or had been working at a company where at least 60% of the people on the staff were homosexual men. Because they kept hiring their friends. And if I were homophobic, I couldn't work here. You know, I mean, if that were generally my mindset, I couldn't be there. Now, these people, these men, all knew my conviction. They all knew what I believed about marriage. They all knew what I believed about homosexuality. They also knew that I treated them with integrity and respect, to work with them, because what they did outside of work and sometimes at work had nothing to do with what we were trying to do in terms of our business. And so we need to be sure we distinguish between tolerance and participation, tolerance and approval. To me, the bottom line of the second commandment is that it should be a constant reminder that we, what was one of the questions I asked you at the end of class, you know, whether there was something to the image of God around? And we, of all created things, were made in the image of God. Only we can be transformed in the spiritual image of Christ, who became flesh as the perfect image, perfect spiritual image of his Heavenly Father. So this commandment is about our special relationship with the Creator, who made us in his likeness and is still molding us into his spiritual image. It reminds us that God is greater than anything we can see or imagine. The reason that trying to make an image of God fails miserably, because there's nothing like him. There's not like him at all. And we should never let that knowledge be pushed aside, knowing that God had infused us this way and wants us to view him that way. And one time we did see how far we got with the third commandment. What is taking the Lord's name in vain? What does that mean? I see smiles. Are there answers behind smiles? What does it mean? To you or to our culture? What does it mean? Use it inappropriately, okay. That's sort of general, but we'll start with Eric. Yes?
Someone said to me once that we are God's ambassadors, and when we're not, we're God's
Okay, that's pretty good too. She said, someone told her that we are God's ambassadors, and we are not being good ambassadors. We're taking his name in vain. Yes? Treating this, that's very good, because the language there sort of says, don't treat my name as if it's empty. You know, if it has no value or no substance. You know, the common assumption in most of our culture is that this relates to using God's name in some form of swearing. And certainly the Old Testament talked about don't use my name to swear at all. No. Don't use my name to make an oath or to swear unless you intend to keep it. Because if you don't intend to keep it, that's taking my name in vain. So it's not that that's not one of the forms, like parts of it, but it's something that does take us to another place. The Old Testament actually identifies several places, several different ways that God's name might be taken in vain. The most obvious would be the blasphemer curse, which happened, was recorded in Leviticus 24, where a young man, we'll get right there, a young man whose father was an Egyptian, his mother was a Jewish, or Israel woman, got in a fight with someone, and in the fight he cursed God. Of course, he used God's name in vain. As a curse, used God to curse this individual in the middle of the fight. And when it was learned, the recommended action was everyone put hands on him to demonstrate the judgment, and then stone him, kill him, because you don't do that. Jean?
I want to ask about the slang words that we use. Sometimes I'm really bad about saying gosh, and Randy always gets on me. Or,
Thanks a lot from me on that.
well, you don't say geez, or, things like that. When I say that, I don't think about blaspheming or God's name, but how does he feel about that?
Yeah. And I don't know that there's a single answer for that. There's no question in my mind that things like gosh or geez, or now the popular thing is OMG, there's no question where they came from. That people were trying to work around taking the name directly, trying to express their strength of view on something without invoking God's name, specifically. And so based on that, I would say, don't use it. Just avoid it. On the other hand, I would say to you, if that's not even in your mind, it's not even something that ever entered your consideration, then it's carelessness rather than intent. Still encourage you not to do it. Stop being careless. But you were never intentionally, I believe, trying to invoke God's name in that situation. There are all sorts of things like that, that get me, I'll find irritating, and different people have a different view of it. In terms of swearing, if anyone goes to testify, testify in court in our state, and I assume it's in most states, what do they ask?
Do you solemnly swear
Or
confirm?
affirm? Because they knew that some of these religious kooks, objected to be asked to put their hand on a Bible and swear. So will you affirm that you're going to tell the truth? And there's a difference, a minor difference, but it's saying, is my word good? Can my word be believed? And so that objection to the use of swearing or somehow invoking God's name made it into our courts. Because then people realize, some people can say, will you swear? They no. I'll tell you the truth, though. And so it became a different sort of an invocation.
And
Yes.
in light of what I said earlier about denigrating God's name and the vision of Him in our mind, OMG, that is on billions of messages and texts and all of that in our culture today, every day. Everybody knows what that means. Okay. In light of what God said in Deuteronomy, why why do I have the right to take the ultimate being in the universe's name and incorporate it into a meaningless expletive?
Because where we are, I'm going to run quickly through some things here. He said you should not swear by my name falsely. That's in Leviticus 19. There's a prohibition on false visions and false claims by prophets. That was blaspheming God's name, saying, well, I have this vision. No, you don't. Sacrificing children to Molech. You know, because that was something that one of the nations did. This god Molech was wanted human flesh, specifically wanted children burned in the altar. And God's view of that is a violation of the commandment because it profaned the name of God. That's in Leviticus 18. But similarly, unlawfully touching holy things. If Aaron and his kin touched some of the holy elements of the sacrifice without proper reverence, that was considered profaning God's name. And if the priests cut corners, as they did in Malachi's day, that was considered profaning the name. You know, and most of those passages don't apply directly to us, but our words reveal our substance. Our words reveal the truth about who we are. We had a message for our daughter this morning, and she had prepared a big batch of lentils, and she's having more lentils, and I was going to respond with, a humorous remark about what that does to your gastrointestinal system. And Allison was discouraged. Why? Just don't go there. Because that reveals something about humor, or guys especially get drawn to bathroom humor too often. But our words should show our devotion. Let's skip over that. What is it about God's name that's so important? Holy? Okay, you want to back up?
There's no better. Is God His name?
Well, that's the name we have. And that's something I'm going to get, because actually you're leading into where I'm going here. Is that His name? What we know of His name is from Hebrew is an abbreviation. They left out the vowels and we make an assumption that it's Yahweh. When Moses was being given his commission by God, he said, all right, if I go there and they say, who is this God that sent you? What is your name? What do you say? Yeah. I come to be, what shall I say to them? Is replied, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And it could be in the Hebrew is to be. So, but it's God is that He is. Yeah, his identity is His name. And so we use God because that's something we've learned to represent us. But His identity is His name. Similarly, get to you in a second. In Exodus 33, well, losing my voice. Exodus 33, God was affirming Moses, God was affirming Moses, and then Moses said, I want to see your glory. And we remember the part where God said, well, you can't do that and live, but here, hide over there, and I'll put my hand in front of your face, in front of you while I walk by, and you can see my back. But what we generally don't catch is something was said just before that. He said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim my name. A way to see or experience or know God's glory is to hear His name. Because His name is who He is. His name is tied up in His identity. His name is tied up in who He is. His name is tied up in His glory. That's one of the first things we know that Jesus said about God's name. Our Father who is in heaven, your name is holy. And so what is His name? All I can say is He said, I am. And His existence that shows Him to be merciful and gracious. God revealed Himself by speaking His name. And that's one reason it was so important that He kept reverence. I'm not out of time here. When I grew up, as I was growing up in the churches of Christ, some of the church preserved and strengthened and wanted people to know as they wanted to be known, people of the book. And that was a good goal. You know, if you had a Bible question, you could go to the Church of Christ and you get an answer. And then you get told about, you know, why you're so lost and what you can do to make it to heaven. But what I really want for all of us to be known as people of His name.